Right. Welcome, welcome everyone. There's going to be quite a few people with us today, so we will give them a few minutes to join. My name is Andrea Bergoa. I am the Higher Ed Marketing Manager here at APA Publishing. We thank you so much for joining us. Please tell us where you're joining from in the chat as everyone gets settled, and I will start with a few housekeeping items and then turn it over to our moderator and panel. Hi, Beth from Chattanooga. I'm also in Chattanooga. Good to see you. So thank you again for attending our webinar on how educators can lean into teaching with AI. Just a few housekeeping items. Methods of communication. Although everyone is muted to prevent accidental noises, we have provided multiple modes of communication and interaction for today. Auto captioning is enabled and can be accessed via the closed captioning button in the Zoom options bar at the bottom. Chat is open and available for all attendees. Please use chat to communicate amongst yourselves. If you have questions for our panel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom options bar. As soon as it is available, we will share a recording of this webinar. That recording will include a transcript of the chat and the session. We will also share any additional resources that may be applicable to today's session. As recognition of your attendance today, you will be receiving an attendance certificate and badge that you can download and share on social media. Again, thank you for attending our session on the advantages of using AI in education. We have a special guest as our moderator for this section. So Dr. Beth Schwartz, Senior Director of Pre-College and Undergraduate Psychology Education here at APA. I am going to turn things over to you. If anyone has any questions, I will address them in chat and Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm going to share my screen so we can get things started. And get my... All right, well, great to be here. I'm really excited to talk about AI because APA as an organization has really prioritized a conversation about looking into the effects of psychological science and how we can ensure that this technology can benefit society, avoid potential harm, and this includes its impact in the classroom. APA had an opportunity in 2023 to testify on the Hill to members of Congress, and it was focused on the importance of taking into account psychological science in the development and understanding of artificial intelligence. This letter that I'm presenting here summarizes that testimony of APA CEO, Dr. Arthur Evans, and you can find the letter in more detail just by using that QR code. The testimony illustrates how APA is focused on how we need to continue to use findings from psychological science to better understand human technology interaction. From the workplace to healthcare to education, as psychologists and psychological scientists, we need to understand and communicate the many ways that our work can inform issues such as ethics, privacy, biases, and human-centered design to optimize how we use AI and how we can do so within our fields expertise to help ensure that these new technologies maximize benefit and reduce potential harm. Now, those of us connected to the world of education at APA recognize the need to examine how AI is impacting the teaching and learning environment, and the need to do so through the lens of psychological science in order to provide database decisions for those who are considering how to incorporate AI in the classroom in order to support faculty, to support student success, and to achieve student learning goals. Just to give you some idea of some of the resources, there are some very helpful resources available at apa.org with articles that address questions concerning AI across the field. So from the impact of AI on human decision-making, to using AI for writing and research, to our focus today of AI in the classroom, and to the more general question of how AI is impacting our field. We also have a number of APA Speaking of Psychology podcasts that are connected to this topic. And again, the QR code takes you right to all of those many great episodes. And then we also have a number of professional development opportunities about AI in the world of psychology. So once again, this topic is a priority for APA as a whole. With regard to AI in the classroom, we're seeing that those leading faculty on campuses across the country They're there to help see beyond the initial questions that came to mind, which focused on students using AI to cheat or to complete assignments as they were writing their essays or doing their research. This, for example, where many thought there was a need to not allow AI as a tool in their classroom. But once experts in the field stepped in, faculty were learning how to use AI to positively impact the learning process, how to develop appropriate policies for AI use in their classrooms. So understanding that we can incorporate AI to help create a stronger, more effective learning environment and to teach AI literacy to our students, to help them add this very important skill to their resumes as they head out into the world that is more and more likely to expect them to know how to use AI in the work environment within whatever career that they choose. And finally, this is clearly on the minds of many as colleges and universities are now being recognized for helping students study AI and creating an AI literate campus in which students obtain those skills needed to enter the workforce now and into the future. And according to AAC&U, 14% of colleges now have adopted AI literacy as a general education requirement, and that number is even higher at larger institutions. But today we're excited to bring together this wonderful panel of experts who are here to answer your questions about AI in the classroom and in the context of teaching and learning. Let me introduce you to our panelists. We have Dr. David Williamson Schaefer, who is the Sears Bascom Professor of Learning Analytics at the University of Wisconsin in their Department of Educational Psychology, and a data philosopher at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research. Before his time at the University of Wisconsin, David was a teacher trainer, curriculum developer, and game designer. Professor Schaefer's current work focuses on merging statistical and qualitative methods to construct fair models of complex and collaborative human activity. He's authored more than 250 publications with over 100 co-authors, including How Computer Games Help Children Learn and Quantitative Ethnography. We're also very pleased to have Dr. Christopher Hakala from Springfield College with us. Dr. Hakala has over 30 years of experience in higher education. Over the years, his research has focused on reading comprehension, teaching and learning, effective faculty development, and assessment. In addition, Chris has been invited to present at many conferences around the country, as well as dozens of colleges and universities, on topics ranging from reading narrative text to how to effectively manage large classrooms, or how to engage students in ways that maximize student learning. At Springfield, Chris runs the Center for Excellence in Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship and teaches courses in the Psych department. And finally, we're excited to also have Joseph Slade, who joins us from Oregon State University. Joe's a PhD student studying the intersection of AI, teaching, and learning. He serves as the director of Project Failsafe, Fostering AI Learning Safely, a collaboration between the departments of psychology and computer science, developing AI education tools and testing their efficacy through controlled experiments and classroom applications. His work focuses on identifying how educators can make the best use of large language models to improve student engagement and learning outcomes. Welcome to all of you, and let me stop sharing my screen and get our panelists on, and we'll start with our questions. So our first question is for all of our panelists, and that first question really gets to those questions of concern. What do you believe, in your opinion, are educators' biggest concerns regarding AI in education, and what should educators be most concerned of with regard to teaching and learning perspectives? So jump in, Chris, David, and Joe, and we'll move forward.
So I'm happy to start. Beth, thanks for the introduction. The biggest concern is that students will shortcut the learning process. And I want to talk about this a little bit with regard to what we're actually talking about when we talk about shortcutting the learning process. And that really has to do with the idea that students, in order to learn, need to engage in the cognitive effort required to do the effective learning that can happen in a classroom. And in many ways, and I'm talking to a group of people who I'm convinced have thought about this, the student work that is required cognitively to do effective learning really is something that has been a concern for a long time. Now AI makes it really easy for students in some ways to be able to shortcut that. What we have to do is really think about the pedagogical decisions we make and consider how we structure the learning experiences so that AI doesn't interfere with student learning. It doesn't replace student learning. It doesn't replace thinking, but rather it builds the scaffolding for students to be able to build upon that. So I think that we need to sort of rethink the way that we go about doing the educational process in order to maximize student learning based on some of these ideas that students can get from AI.
I might add, our traditional sort of assessments, be they multiple choice tests or short answer kind of questions like that you can answer online, and a lot of the assignments, the essay, discussion posts, they're all challenged by, especially a student who knows how to use AI well. It's becoming very difficult to tell the difference between a student using AI to supplement the response and a student just doing it on their own. Especially if the student, is good at prompting, is good at using the AI, not necessarily just copying and pasting the output. I don't know how many students actually do that anymore versus use it as a first draft and kind of coax the answer after that. But so if our traditional assignments and our traditional assessment methods can't be relied upon as indicators of student learning, yeah, where do we turn to next? I think that's a big challenge that we all have to face.
Yeah, and I want to take just a tiny step back. So we're talking about generative AI here, and as opposed to predictive AI, in the form of large language models. There are actually other kinds of AI that have, some of which have been used for a long time in education. It's just students don't have access to those in the same way. I would say I would agree with what folks are saying. Teachers' biggest concerns are. I think what we should be worried about is that basically this is so new and moving so fast that it's hard to actually know what we're looking at. We don't really even know what large language models are going to be capable of. Sometimes we don't even know what they're capable of now. We don't really know what their impact on society is going to be, and we don't entirely know how to use them as educators yet. There's some things we know. We know that it's unreliable, biased, environmentally destructive, extremely expensive, and yeah, and the reporting in the last couple of days also it's started sexting with minors. So like there's obviously a lot of things that we could worry about from that point of view. And we definitely don't want to make the same mistakes that we made with social media, which is essentially waiting until the harms were clear before actually engaging with it. But I actually think the biggest mistake is probably not using it enough. And therefore not teaching students to use it well for all the definitions of well, because they almost certainly are going to use it, and they almost certainly will have to use it when they go out into the world in one form or another.
That's great. And so that's a great transition to our second question. And maybe we'll start with Chris and then David. Chris, could you share the most common ways AI is being used effectively in teaching and learning? And the second part of that question, David, was what are some effective ways to design assignments that encourage students to use and interact with generative AI?
So I'll just start with one of the distinctions that needs to happen, and I see it sometimes, I don't others, is the distinction between who's using it, whether the faculty members using it for the creation of materials or whether the students are using it to support their learning. And I think there's really value in both sides. And I couldn't agree more with what David's saying with regard to we need to use it more in a lot of ways to see what it does and what it can't do. Faculty members use it to support learning by developing materials using this. And I'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later. But the way that faculty members can do it is they can create materials for classroom discussions. They can create materials for assessment development. They can create materials for slide creation, image creation. They can assist with assessments, although that's controversial, whether they assist with scoring exams, but they can use it for that, lecture ideas, discussion topics, etc. It can generate a lot of ideas, and we're talking about generative AI. It can build out ideas and help us sort of break out of habits that we might have had in the construction of our classes and help us think about things in ways we might not have thought of before, which makes for our classes to be kind of dynamic and engaging and really helps in looking at things in a way that either I might not have ever thought about. For students, they're using it for all sorts of things too. Students are using it sometimes to just smooth out their writing. Sometimes they're creating answers and writing papers. Sometimes they're creating study guides. They're creating outlines. And I really want to make this very clear. Students, when they do this, if it is replacing the thinking that we want the students to do, it is not supportive of learning. And that's something that we really need to be careful of. It's when students are using it to support the learning, say they're creating a study guide, that can be a very effective approach for students, because students might be creating a study guide or quiz questions to test themselves once. It takes a lot of effort. And if they're doing it with AI, they can do it multiple times and generate multiple ways for them to quiz themselves so they can be more effective in understanding the content. One of the things that's really important to keep clear is that when faculty use AI to generate materials, they're able to look at those materials, think about whether or not those materials are truly representative of their field, because they have the expertise to be able to evaluate whether or not that material that's produced is indicative and representative of what they want to do. And so faculty, when they use it, it's incumbent upon them to look at that material and really think about it, and think about that it is representing the ideas, the concepts, the structure they want. Students don't quite have that. And so that's one of the places where we need to be teaching students. We need to be leaning in to help students understand how to make sense out of what they get out of generative AI, how to use it effectively, and how to really think about what those answers mean, and to maybe use those answers as a stepping off point for more deep learning experiences. So I think there's lots of ways people are doing it really effectively. And I think some of those things are showing up in a variety of classes. They're showing up in psychology classes, but at other institutions, showing up in science classes, they're showing up in business classes, they're showing up in counseling classes. There's lots of ways to think about this. And so I think there's a lot of excitement about being able to use this effectively. But there's of course the caveats. David, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, we can't give an exhaustive list here, although I will point out that there's a bunch of great ideas in the chat, some of them better than what I'm about to say. Um, but I mean, let me give a sort of a quick example. One of the things that we can do is ask students to explicitly get AI to do an assignment, and to get AI to do the best possible job they can get it to do. Well, that actually does involve a lot of critical thinking, if you've ever tried to do it. But more than that, this is actually an old idea, right? So Seymour Papert, back in the 1970s, was talking about the idea of letting the student be the expert, letting the student program the machine rather than the other way around. And you can learn so much from seeing examples of bad work and critiquing them. And it's much easier to do that when the bad work is from the AI. There's a great study from 20 or so years ago in the field of learning sciences called Betty's Brain, where basically Chris is nodding, yeah, the students would essentially develop a scientific concept map for Betty, and you could sort of see it inside her head. And then the cool thing was that the assessment was that they would test Betty. Betty would take a test. And the thing was, when Betty got something wrong, students didn't see that as their lack of understanding. What they saw it was an opportunity to improve. And it basically moved a sort of assessment as a kind of punishment and rating to an assessment as something that was formative. There's been a ton of work on auto tutors, much of it from Art Grazer and Shengyan Hu at Memphis. And so I was talking to Shengyan the other day, and he basically re-implemented all of the auto tutor work, 20 years of work, and he did it entirely by himself and using AI, so that now students can basically pick any topic and they can generate sort of scientifically validated approaches to having it ask them questions, to being in a fishbowl where the AI is playing all the other characters in the fishbowl, and on and on and on. I couldn't even list all the things that you can do. It tracks all the interactions. It can provide reports about, what students have been doing. Right. So there's all kinds of things that we can do, building on past ideas and inventing things that we weren't able to do before. But I guess my fundamental thing is, like, why are we still designing assignments that AI can do for the student? I mean, it seems to me that the opportunity is to design assignments that neither the student alone nor the AI alone can do. And, one of the quickest ways to figure that out is, pick a couple of AI models and give them the assignment and see what they do. And you want something that's hard enough that it actually requires a fair amount of thinking on the part of the student to actually engage with the AI in a way that's going to be constructive. The other thing about giving the assignment to AI and seeing what it can do is you might actually find that it doesn't do things as well as you think. For people who haven't engaged deeply with AI, and that's many of us, I'm not casting stones here, but most of our engagement with it is we ask a question that we sort of care about a little bit, and it says something that like seems remotely plausible, and we go, "Oh my God, how could it do that?" Right? This is a miracle. And then as soon as you start to dig in deeper, like you start to realize that actually it doesn't really know what it's talking about, and it doesn't actually know how to repair it, fix its code very well. And actually, it doesn't really write that well once it's a complex topic and it's something that I actually know about. So the getting involved yourself with AI is probably one of the best ways to get started to think about what it can do and how you can leverage that to get your students to use it in lots of different ways to do the kind of thinking that Chris is talking about.
Great. I'm going to transition us a little bit, and Joe, this next one's for you. How do you balance the effective use of AI while being mindful of the environmental impact that many are talking about these days?
No, that's tough. And a lot of that is going to come down to, I guess, to personal discernment. But we could do more, maybe making people aware of the cost, let's say per use. Let's say every single question costs, I don't know, somebody said like a bottle of water, or you could even say in terms of a dollar amount or something like that. Kind of like we have calories on menus now, and that was like top down, that was enforced restaurants, you have to do that. Something like that might help. If you could actually see maybe the energy consumption or something like that per query, maybe then you'd have a better understanding of what environmental impact you're having by using these tools, because it's so easy to forget. When you're just sitting there in a conversational exchange, going back and forth with ChatGPT or something like that. I don't know about you, but environment is usually the last thing on my mind. So potentially we could make people more aware of those costs. It's kind of astounding, the deep research model. If you really give it an in-depth question, something that it has to process for, 5, 10 or more minutes, it can cost up to $5 or $10 for that one request, And then you imagine people going back and forth, and you start to understand why OpenAI still hasn't turned a profit. And none of these other large language model, kind of foundation large language model companies, I don't think any of them have come up with a sustainable business plan yet. But yeah, the fact that ChatGPT is free for everyone to use at some level, and that there is an environmental impact with every message exchange, that is difficult to wrestle.
Indeed. Let's get back to something that we've talked about previously, and this is David and Chris. You can both respond, and of course Joe as well. But I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on to what extent does AI actually short circuit the cognitive processes used for critical thinking that many of us have as learning goals in our classrooms.
Yeah, so this is sort of the big elephant in the room, right? I mean, all the other things are important, but this is kind of central, especially from those of us who have a sort of psychological perspective. So I don't want to be that guy, but like literally, this concern has been around essentially forever. 200 years ago, people were saying that printed textbooks could lead to passive learning, undermining critical and higher order thinking. Blackboards and typewriters would lead to rote copying rather than reflection and analysis. Film, radio, and TV would displace reading and deeper engagement. Calculators would atrophy arithmetic and logical reasoning. Computers enable only surface level or rote interaction, resulting in a loss of creativity, lack of critical understanding, mindless interaction, atrophying of fundamental cognitive skills. This is just sort of the things that people were saying, at the time. The internet, people said, fosters rapid information and skimming rather than deep comprehension, and overexposes students to unfiltered, uncurated information. The second part is absolutely true, but it's all the more reason why students actually need to use the internet and need to learn to use it well. Now, I'm not trying to make fun of the concerns that people have today. Those are totally legitimate. But if if new technologies cause cognitive decline, then basically we've been declining since the mid 1700s when textbooks started to be printed in the United States and widely used in schools. So I think we have to move past just whatever our knee-jerk reaction is about what a new technology is doing. I mean, more generally, of course, technology changes how we think. That's actually its point. That's why we have them. And this is, by the way, not just cognitive technologies. You know, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The point is, we never actually think about anything without technology. We've all just forgotten that 5,000 years ago, writing was a disruptive technology. And it's a disruptive technology that eventually led to the scientific revolution and all that comes with it. Part of the reason that AI is so makes us so agitated is that it just makes this particularly obvious, this offloading of cognition, of parts of cognition to the technology, because what it does looks on the surface so much like human thinking. And you know, the way I think about this is that the question we want to ask ourselves as educators is, what can students do? And what do we want them to be able to do in a rapidly changing world? Because the folks who've been doing performance assessment have been wrestling with this for 30 or 40 years, right? If you actually have a performance that matters, then the question is, can they competently pull off that performance using the appropriate tools rather than some sort of second order inferred mental state underneath it? That's not to say that investigating those mental states isn't important, but it may not be, the mental state may not actually be the end that we're aiming for. It's a proxy measure in a sense. And I think this is particularly important because the hard problems we face today, climate change, disinformation, rising inequality, name your issue, those are going to be solved not by AI alone or by people alone. They're going to be solved by young people using AI. And look, I don't know if it matters, but I use Google search and AI to help me do some of the research for what I just said. And I formatted it using a word processor. And I'm quite certain AI could not have written this without a lot of careful expert human guidance. And I'm pretty sure that the conclusion shouldn't be that I was just cheating and have no idea what I'm talking about because I'm parroting what AI said. So I just point that out as sort of food for thought.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I just want to add that cognitive capacity is a precious limited capacity. We don't have the ability to do all of the things that we want to do to be able to think things through carefully. And we've been forever, as David pointed out, offloading our cognitive capacity onto some other thing. So we have additional cognitive capacity to do other things. And what the calculators did and what SPSS did for statistics is that it offloaded some of that work so that we could then spend the time doing the higher level thinking. Now, you shouldn't offload without knowledge. People should understand some level of things underneath. And we can go back and forth about how much math people should know, but they should understand what they're getting out of the computer. But at the end of the day, if you ask someone what someone should know about statistics or what someone should know about some of these higher level things, it's not the basic pieces that can be offloaded. It's more complex. And we want to move forward in knowledge construction. And we move forward in knowledge construction by scaffolding up and building that up. Students need to go through experiences where they learn how to use this so that then they see the value of offloading some of their cognitive effort to do the things that they need to do the higher level cognitive thinking. I mean, listen, I've been teaching for 33 years. I want my students, when they finish, to be way better than I was when I finished in 1995. I want them to be that good. And that's what we're building that up.
I might just add, there are some real strengths to large language models. I think the one I notice most is your ability just to have a conversation with it and kind of forget that you're no longer talking to a machine. And you can build out assignments that involve a lot more dialogue. And you can do it in an audio fashion, meaning that it verbally reads what it wrote, and then you can speak, and then it transcribes that such that You can basically be on the phone, or you can, have your laptop in front of you or peripheral to where you are, and it gives you a mini lesson and every once in a while stops and asks you like an open-ended discussion question. And then you go up and you click the record button and you record your best effort at summarizing the topics that were just presented to you. And then you send that message back, and then it can evaluate your answer. And it can say, yeah, you got some things right, but here's some other things that you're missing. Do you want to go over this a little more, or should we move on to another topic? So, you can, we have been for a long time, been able to have a recorded lecture playing in our ear, while we're walking down the street or doing laundry or whatever. But that can be more passive versus if you turn it into a conversation. It's part lecture, part, somebody interrogating how much that knowledge stuck with you. I think that can be a really powerful tool. So leaning into the strengths of large language models, I would say, be a benefit.
Well, and Joe, this actually is a great transition to the next question. Can you address the tension that exists between the assumed objectivity of AI when in fact it reflects the implicit bias of human data?
Yeah. So it's generative AI is machine learning, so it's based off of its training data. It's only as good as its training data. So it's only as good as all of the content of the internet, that was filtered into it. But then it underwent a process called reinforcement learning through human feedback. And what that basically means is that, and this happened in a lot of countries like Central America and Africa and other places like this, where people would spend all day looking at content that was generated by the early versions of the large language models. And they would have to rate, like, is this acceptable or is this unacceptable? And companies like OpenAI would, provide them with rubrics for evaluating whether or not content was acceptable or unacceptable. And this went on for, I don't know how many months. It took a long time because the early output of some of these language models could be really graphic and controversial and not something that you want available to the general public. So they had to put in guardrails by reinforcing and punishing different responses over and over and over. And there's still a thumbs up and a thumbs down button for every, say, ChatGPT request that you can still continue this process. But every step of that way, people were involved. And I would say in particular, like whatever that rubric was that OpenAI gave to their employees to judge, positive, negative, what was the message of that rubric? Because that's going to be sort of the personality of the model. And probably the best example of that in action is, Elon Musk's xAI, their large language model called Grok. It was trained on like all the Twitter posts and all that kind of stuff. But it has a very different political slant than like a ChatGPT. If you ask the two of them the same question, especially on a controversial subject, you're going to get two very different answers. And that should be proof alone that they are different. They have biases. They have, I wouldn't call it like a personality per se, but something like that.
Well, and given all these concerns, maybe Chris, you can tell us in your experience what policies are institutions creating for the use of AI in education?
So this is a really interesting question. As someone who sits in a teaching center as well as a psychology faculty member, is how are college and universities sort of looking at how to help inform faculty, because faculty are looking for guidance in what to do with AI, how to use it, how to leverage it. And some of the early days, faculty were looking for policies against AI, but now it's becoming a lot more nuanced. The reality is, though, that the policies really run the gamut. And I have seen policies where AI is not allowed in any classes at some institutions, to where AI is expected and is part of the learning objectives. A lot of places are landing in the middle and saying faculty need to inform themselves about why they might want to include AI in their class, why they might want to engage in AI practice themselves, and use that as a guidance. I know that some institutions are with students having faculty really be intentional and think about the assignments and then signaling to students somehow the availability of AI in the construction of their answers. Like for some assignments, you shouldn't use AI. For some, you can use a little. Some you can use whatever you want. And in those cases, what's been really interesting is those faculty have been incredibly intentional about teaching students how AI could support that assignment, how AI might not support that assignment. So I think there's really right now, it really is all over the map. And it's going to be interesting to see where it lands over the next couple of years. One of the things that I want to pick up on what Joe said a little bit that I think is really interesting is one of the reasons why some of these decisions are being made really have to do with the AI model that is the predominant model on that particular campus and how much people are seeing the AI model respond appropriately or respond in ways that are hallucinations or giving false information. And so really, David brought up before the notion that you really need to engage with AI. If you're not engaging with AI, it really becomes a matter of looking at this thing and thinking yes or no based on what you're seeing from one perspective. And it's really important to investigate it. I think college and university is going to get really good at having committees to talk about how AI is going to be used and what the policies are going to be. But I think we're still a long way from landing on any kind of policy. Most colleges I know of that I've spoken to through the teaching center network that I have, AI used for students has landed in academic integrity areas where faculty have begun to talk about, is it a violation of academic integrity? And I think we're going to continue to have those debates. It's I really feel confident that in the next several years, we're going to have a more consistent model. But for right now, it really is all over the place.
Yeah, and actually, as a follow-up to that, David, can you tell us your thoughts on the potential double standard that's there where instructors use AI, but they prohibit their students from using it? Oh, you're on mute, David.
Yeah, that's the mantra of COVID.
Right.
You're muted. So like I mean, it's totally understandable that could happen. I still think it's hypocritical though. I say that partly because I don't think students should be prohibited from using AI, nor do I think instructors should actually. I think teachers need to use it and to understand better what it can and can't do. But on the other hand, like we know that teaching is more than just following a computer-generated lesson plan. And I'm pretty sure that the computer-generated lesson plans by themselves are not actually necessarily the best lesson plans. But the point is that we don't worry about teachers using it. We don't think somehow that students are getting a lower quality of instruction because we believe that teaching is something that requires more than just the AI can do. So I don't really understand why we worry so much about students writing and critical thinking and other skills. We care about them, but I also think there's a lot more to writing and critical thinking skills than just producing words or just producing the right answer for something. I will say, I think it is extremely problematic to use AI for grading without some kind of process for checking its results. And to be clear, there are ways to do that, right? I mean, one way to do it would be to ask the AI to give bad comments on students' work, and then give that back to the students and ask them to explain why the comments are wrong. That would be fun. Or summarize, summarize those ideas across a work in a small group, right? What are the common themes to the bad comments? You could even seed some kind of particularly bad assessment, right, of the student work, and then that could actually be the point of the lesson. So there's lots of creative things that you can do as a teacher. I should mention two other things. So one of them is there actually are emerging ways of being able to assess what a student is doing through its collaboration with AI, right? So if student has to submit the transcript of their dialogue with AI, the model right behind me, epistemic network analysis, can actually figure out what kinds of cognitive relationships the student is seeing in the context of the AI without giving the AI credit for making those connections itself. And then the second thing is, so I saw in the chat something go by about, the importance of being an expert before you start using AI. It's sort of you have to have 10,000 hours of experience before you could use this. And that's I think based on partly on an older model of how it is that we have to learn things. right? If this is the only computer we have, this is the only information processor that we have, then yeah, we have to develop all the rules for that information processor. But if you look at work, again, it's older work, but we've been around for a long time. The idea that expertise is actually not encoded in sophisticated rules. Expertise is coded in experience. That what we're doing as an expert is simply, reaching out to our library of experience and doing the obvious thing. Well, that actually suggests that the thing you want to do most quickly is get people to have good experiences and not necessarily to focus on the learning of those underlying rules that are just an excuse to get those experiences. My point in all this is that there are a lot of creative ways to rethink what we're doing, but it does require a certain amount of rethinking.
Well, and talking more about psychological science and learning, we know from the science that student engagement in the material helps the learning process. So, Chris, I'm wondering if you can share any ideas that you have on how we can use AI to create scenarios or simulations in the classroom that improve student engagement.
Yeah, so one of the really exciting things, and I really appreciate what you said, David, about faculty using it for a variety of things, and it's not shortcutting what faculty are doing. What AI actually can do is it can really enhance a faculty member's toolkit for using in the classroom. And one of the classic examples that I've been seeing a lot of is, at least at my institution, and I've heard about other institutions within psychology, is that they use it to create scenarios for students to then analyze. And these scenarios can really take shape based on how the AI is prompted. And those scenarios then allow the students to dig into those things in different ways. It doesn't violate any kind of legal issues. It doesn't violate anything else. It allows the faculty member to create multiple of these to give students more opportunities to practice. And that's been really, really helpful. I can say this in statistics. You can, a lot of faculty have used it for generating data sets for statistics. If anyone's ever taught statistics in the past, generating data sets that work the way you want them to is incredibly challenging and time consuming. AI can produce these kinds of data sets really, really quickly along the lines of exactly whatever parameters you want to set. And those are really effective. So as an educator, it's really thinking about how you want to devote your time as you're thinking about what you want to do in class. And I would rather spend time thinking about how I'm going to move the students through a conceptual understanding of a t-test or a conceptual understanding of an ANOVA than I want to spend the time generating a data set that comes out the way I want it to. So I think that that's been really beneficial. I'll also say that, and there was an article that came out in the Harvard Business Review the other day that I thought was a really fascinating way to use it, is they had AI create some scenarios, and then they used the students to, then they used AI and had the students generate solutions, first using AI, but then interpreting and critiquing the AI. So AI created the scenario, and then the students used AI to come up with an answer, and then they were able to have a dialogue. And I know David mentioned this before about having a dialogue with what the AI did well and what the AI did not do well. And I think that those kinds of opportunities exist now without AI, but it's an enormous time drain on faculty when they really could be designing things that would enhance even more what students are doing. So there's a lot of that work going on right now across different campuses. And I think these are less controversial. I mean, I saw several people put in a chat about using AI to grade. That's much more of a controversial thing. And I think there's pros and cons to that. But I think for generating materials and creating scenarios and generating activities that are going to lead to student engagement, I think it's really powerful. I can say that students really enjoy the opportunity not only to engage in a discussion based on something that might be generated from AI, but also why AI came up with that format and how they could have improved it. And I've seen that happen in a variety of cases where students then can not only engage in the discussion, but then really pull apart the logic behind it. And I think one of the things that's really been challenging when you talk about student engagement is that our students have become very comfortable just receiving information. And part of that has been, for many years, education's been a one-way street. AI frees up some of that so that we can then engage the students more actively in the classroom. Whether you have a lot of students in a class, you can have them do it in small groups. If you have a small class, you can do it as a whole class. But it really has had the opportunity of creating materials that can be used pedagogically within the classroom that really advance conversations.
Mm-hmm. And I'll finish with one more question for all of you, and this really follows up with what Chris was saying. And what I'd love to hear about is what is the most innovative way you can imagine AI assisting educators and students? So Joe, if we can start with you, let's start with students.
Yeah. So I could imagine in the not too distant future that you could do something like upload a textbook, like let's say an open source textbook, something that you have the rights to, into some kind of tutoring system that could then break it down into chapters, break it down into sections, and then provide for a student something like a user interface where it has a bunch of different options for how you want to learn. It's like, do you just want to read the textbook? Just read the PDF. Do you want little summaries of these things? We can do that too. Do you want to play a game? We have a few different review games to choose from. Do you want flashcards? Here are some flashcards. There's some fun, like dialogic kind of exercises that we've used, just using like ChatGPT's custom GPTs, to where, you know, you can essentially ask it to serve as like an instructor, teaching students about the fundamental attribution error. And then as in groups of 2 or 3 students, they solve the problem together in class. You know, so they click the link and then they go through the procedure. You know, it explains what it is, the fundamental attribution error, gives some scenarios, and then asks like, can you think of any times in your life when something like this may have happened? And it seemed to go over really well. And there are other, you know, kind of group work options too, to where you can have students working together in person, also using the AI. Or as David mentioned earlier, there's an Art Gracer, the Auto Tutor kind of reborn. I think they're calling it like the Socratic tutor. And he has these exercises that he calls trialogues, to where it's like the student is sitting there kind of in this classroom with a co-student next to them. And then there's like a professor up top. That way, you know, the professor is kind of teaching and asking questions, but the student doesn't always have to answer them. Sometimes their co-student will answer the questions, or sometimes the co-student will ask questions of the professor or ask questions, and it just makes it a lot more interactive and engaging, and those kind of activities could be a lot of fun.
Now, we've mentioned grading and some of the controversy around there, but I wonder, many faculty could list some very routine tasks that they wish they could offhand to AI. Chris, can you talk a little bit about that, about how educators or faculty can leverage AI to streamline some of those routine tasks?
Sure. I mean, there's lots of things, and I mentioned some of these before with regard to maybe generating ideas for interesting discussion topics, generating ideas for lecture structures and how they're going to go about approaching a problem in class. But I also think faculty have started to think about how AI can help them with constructing materials that might open up accessibility within the class. So I know that many people have seen the Notebook LM will create that a podcast when you upload things. Well, that might be an alternative way for students to access the syllabus. It can create infographics, might be an alternative way for students to access the information. So you can provide students with lots of different ways. And what it actually does is it allows for the production of more material for students to really wrestle with. So, for example, for students, when they want to be able to practice taking quizzes, it can generate multiple quiz questions for students to practice in. It can generate all kinds of, as I said, scenarios. A lot of these things faculty would do before, but they took a lot of time and effort. And now they can do it more quickly and generate more. So it streamlines the time, but also increases the probability of students being able to engage in that and learn from that. So a lot of these things are really, really effective. The other piece is it can do searches for new material. It can go out and find new content that you might not see in your day-to-day searches. It can help guide you towards interesting ways of thinking about things that you might not have had in your periphery. So it has the opportunity to expand what a faculty member does. And I think part of it is being open to that learning that can go on. And pedagogy might change some, and that's okay. It opens up the opportunity for you to think about how your pedagogy is going to change and how it can really be much more effective at creating that learning environment for the students.
David, anything to add to that?
You know, in the interest of time, I'm basically just going to say no. I think, you know, I think that one of the great things about these models is they open up possibilities. And one of the ways to find out what the possibilities are is actually to ask it. I wouldn't take its first answer at face value, but it's a remarkably self-referential tool in that sense.
Excellent. Well, Andrea, if we have any questions from the chat, I'm gonna turn it over to you to address some.
Are so many questions.
I bet.
I want to thank everyone for your feedback and your interaction today. This has been a wonderful webinar, and thank you to our panel for your wonderful responses. I think one of the more common themes that I'm seeing in the Q&A in the chat is about privacy concerns when using AI, and how do we teach students about the privacy that they're giving up if they use AI, and what they should be looking for or not submitting to something like ChatGPT.
Yeah, there's a short answer to that question, which is basically in the not too distant future, there are going to be language models that you can run on your own machine that are probably similar in power to the mid-range models now. So it may just be a technological issue that makes that go away. I know at my own university, when you use the university-sponsored AI platforms, it actually, all the data is anonymized and can't be used for training. So there are sort of some technological solutions along the way. I defer to Chris or Joe about the best way to actually teach sort of the privacy issues that have come up in large language models and everything else we do these days.
Yeah, it's like you can't get a driving app to work without giving it your location. And there is a lot of convenience, that can be had from giving up some of that information. And I know that it seems like the younger generations are more and more comfortable with doing that. But yeah, there is danger, because how uncomfortable is it for you to be talking about hiking boots and then all of a sudden you see ads in your email pop up, and it's like, it's happening all the time. And if you increasingly give more and more training data, you're going to get more of that. So it'll have pros and it'll have cons, and maybe just talking about that conversation in a nuanced way.
Yeah, I would just like to add that there are some things that are out of our control with regard to privacy. For example, Taylor and Francis recently sold their entire catalog of materials to one of the LLMs to be searchable. So there are some things that are out of our control for privacy. And I think that it's a really interesting thing, as both Joe and David said, there's certain things that if you don't give up a little bit of your privacy, you don't get the benefits. It's really hard. It's not something that I think is the best answer, but I also think it's going to be something that eventually is going to be something we're going to settle on. David's thoughts about the bots that are internal, I think, is something that's going to help alleviate some of those concerns. But it is one of those concerns, like the environmental concerns, that we don't have a solution for yet, but we're going to continue to look for one that helps people feel comfortable.
Thank you so much. And another one of the common themes in Q&A in the chat is the topic of AI literacy, which we have touched on a few times. This particular question is on the different levels of comfort that students have using AI. So how do we get all students on the same level so they can then use AI with comfort and equally? Go ahead.
So I want to start with, as in my role, I can tell you we're never going to get everybody to the same level of anything. But I think intentionality really matters. And I think that colleges and universities need to really think about how to integrate AI into their curriculum in a thoughtful way, not as an add-on, not as something that is just thrown out there as this is what you should do, but really think about where AI makes sense curricularly, think about where it makes sense in terms of supporting learning. And I think that the hard conversation and faculty being open to that hard conversation allow for really good decisions to be made about where AI makes sense. And I'm on David's side in that I don't think I think running from it, and I saw this in the chat by a number of people, running from it's not the answer, even in the early years, but it's about, okay, if you're going to have a first year seminar, where does AI make sense in your first year seminar? What part of that structure does it make sense to have the conversation about where to use it? And as you move through the curriculum, you ratchet up how AI becomes part of what it is that you're thinking about in a pedagogical sense, knowing that students are going to be doing it in lots of different ways anyway. But building that base early on and helping students sort of understand it is, I think, a way that a lot of colleges are going to go.
Yeah, maybe trying to decide for yourself, like if I were to go about using AI to accomplish a writing task, what is the best way that I could do that? You know, in terms of ethics, in terms of, yeah, even learning practically, how do I use this tool well? And then breaking that down into steps, and then maybe building an assignment, like a writing assignment for your students, in which you say, okay, we're going to write something together using AI, and I'm going to show you how to do it well. So you can model that process. You can model the fact that they should have like an AI use statement and, you know, cite it properly and, you know, be very upfront and clear about how they used it and when. You know, David mentioned including transcripts. Like, yeah, like try to make it as transparent as possible. But first you have to figure out what is the ideal use of AI for a writing task. Like you have to decide that for yourself first, and then you can work backwards.
David, do you mind if I jump in real quick right here? I have one more comment I want to
No,
make.
please, go ahead.
That is what Joe said, I think is incredibly important. And that is students, we get students in with the assumption that they can do certain things, and we operate under those assumptions. It's really important to help students understand what you expect them and how they're expected to do things. And so demonstrating this in class is really valuable. And I'll go so far as in early classes, I demonstrate to students how I go about writing and editing the work that I do, just so they see what the process looks like. Not to assume they've done it before, but to help them recognize this is what professionals do, this is what we're hoping you do, and this is what we're going to build up the skills for you to do. I think the same thing goes for AI literacy. Demonstrate it, show them, and help them work through that.
And given the speed at which AI is changing, we have to continue to review what that AI policy is and how we're going to teach students AI, because that's going to change with each and every passing semester.
Yeah. If I could pull out one more thing from what Joe said, which I thought was great. The thing we have to do is actually first answer for ourselves what actually, first of all, what are we expecting students to get to do and get from writing, and what role can AI play in that? And only then a lot of these other questions become answerable.
Mhm.
Okay. Oh my gosh, there's so many here. I'm having a hard time. There have been also a lot of questions about recommended platforms, AI platforms. So if any of our panelists have any advice for the attendees here on what they should recommend to their students or anything that's regularly available, I will take that this time.
I know Gemini, they have a deal for students to where it'll be like, I think it's almost a year free. Could be a good introduction. I stick with ChatGPT, Claude. You know, I don't go into the weeds with all those different tools because they're basically like a wrapper around those tools anyway. So if you prompt them correctly, you can pretty much get it to do whatever any of those diverse tools are.
Yeah, I don't have it in front of me, but I saw a webinar by Eddie Watson where he talked about how many of the AIs that exist out there all feed back and use the large language model of just a few of the bots. And so a lot of them are just redundant and just different packaging. So for example, Copilot, which is part of some Microsoft suites, actually works off of ChatGPT 4. So you'll get similar prompt responses when you do that. So there really is, and I agree with Joe. I mean, I kind of stick with some of the similars. I like Perplexity too, but they all kind of have a similar kind of flavor to them. And sometimes you can try a couple different ones to see what kinds of answers and responses you get. And I've actually used an answer from ChatGPT into Perplexity to get some response back to see what it does with it. And that's been really helpful just to play around with it and see what it can do and how it does it.
Yeah, I'll just the one I agree with what you guys are saying, although a student actually recently introduced me to Undermined, which is basically designed for deep academic literature searches. And it's worth trying. I mean, sure, it probably is going back to some of the same models, but there is some advantage in having something that's trained already to do the kinds of things that you want to do, so you don't have to reinvent your prompts all the time.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. And I saw a comment in the chat, time to take this to AI to synthesize it, which I thought was hilarious. So thank you so much for that. In full transparency, I also used AI to prepare for this webinar. There were many questions that were submitted in advance. So I'll give my credit to Microsoft Copilot. And thanks for that. And thank you to all of our panelists, all of our attendees. I'm sorry if we didn't get to one of your questions. We had so much great interaction and questions. We appreciate all of you, and we hope to see you again. Thank you for all of your little reactions. Appreciate that, and all of your great responses and feedback. So again, thank you so much for attending this webinar. We will be sending out the recording and chat transcript as soon as it is available. Look out for attendance certificates in the next week or so. That is a manual process, so please be patient with us. Thank you to Dr. Beth Schwartz for being here and being our wonderful moderator, and to Chris, David, and Joe for being here as our panelists. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks. Take care.